See if.
Are you serious? Oh, I like on the website.
Okay. So I know it's had a couple of days since the last time we met, so we have to refresh where we were and now try to get through the end of that argument. Let me explain what Descartes thinks he's got to do, and then we'll show the different pieces that we have to finish, and then we'll come back to a problem. So, last time I told you that he thinks, after the success of the second meditation, that he's got something that we call the truth rule. And I'll sometimes abbreviate that, but for now, I'll say that it's whatever I clearly and distinctly perceive to be true, if you want to add that, is true. And that truth rule, he still says, despite the fact that it seemed that we could rely now upon the truth rule because the cogito was true, he still thinks that in order to guarantee that rule, right, he needs to establish two things. That God exists, and that God is not a deceiver. So those two things together are needed to ensure that that rule that he is using to construct eventually his science is going to be one that he can rely upon. Now, before I say anything more, it should all have occurred to you, even if you didn't read the book, that if he wants to prove each of these, and they are separate and distinct, at least as presented here, they're separate and distinct pieces, it should have occurred to you that if he wants to prove both of these, what has he got to do? How would you go about proving anything, ever, in philosophy? So, yeah, it seems that he has to use the truth rule to prove that anything, including that God exists and that God is not a deceiver. So, if it's the case that he can't rely upon the truth rule and he tries to go and prove these things, it's going to come back to haunt him because he's using the thing that he's supposed to eventually be validating when he successfully establishes these two things to be true, right? Imagine he arrives at wonderful proofs for each of these things. Well, at bottom, some of those proofs, or part of those proofs, are going to involve some clear and distinct perceptions, but how can he be confident that it's clear and distinct perceptions that he used to prove God's existence or God's goodness are in fact true? Now, if you think he's got a real problem there, then you think that he's got the problem of the Cartesian circle. Right? I don't know if I want to have a problem named after me, because there's good and bad, right? The Mahonian problem. He's got this problem. It's really famous, right? Okay, so the Cartesian circle. The Cartesian circle is, it seems that Descartes is reasoning in a circle. It seems that he's going to be unable to establish the existence or the goodness of God unless he can rely upon the truth rule. But he can't rely upon the truth rule unless he establishes the existence and goodness of God. Right? So that is maybe the biggest problem for the meditations. It seems to be trapped in a circle. Now, You're lucky because you have a professor who, when he teaches Descartes, says, no, there's a way out of the circle, right? Some philosophers just love subjecting him to the criticism that he's reasoning in a circle and kind of leave him to that. I don't. I want to go and say there's a way to get out of this. And Descartes thinks there's a way to get out of it. So you've got more optimistic people on Descartes. But some people think that's an intractable problem for him. What I want to do today is look again at the argument for God's existence and finish with that. And then look at the argument for God is not a deceiver, which we haven't really addressed, and show that it has actually got two parts, this argument that God is not a deceiver. And it's the second part that takes up meditation 4, which is a really interesting meditation. Okay, but I'm going to come back, if I have time, to this Cartesian circle and see if there's a way out of it. But it won't make sense to talk about a way out of this until you've fully understood this, but really not until you've fully understood God is not a deceiver. Only when you fully understand that can you have a way out of the Cartesian circle. Okay, so God exists. Let's turn to that. Now, we did go through the argument last time, and I won't repeat it all, but I think there's a very good version of the argument that basically avoids some of the complications I think are unnecessary that you have on page 143 of the book, but I'll project it here anyways. This is basically, on 143, this is the sort of the distillation of the most important parts of that argument. So last time I basically tried to show you the meaning of 1 and 2. And I tried to suggest that if you accepted 1 and 2, you had to accept 3. So I don't want to repeat the entire argument, but let me just emphasize what that was about. The claim was that Descartes looks within all of the ideas in his mind, and amongst all the ideas, of which there are different types, and we talked about that, he finds this idea of an infinite substance, which is God. As far as the philosophers are concerned, that's God, right? So he finds this idea, and he realizes that this idea is, first of all, an idea of a thing that he has no experience of, right? Because he's never had, as it were, an experiential encounter with a divine being. And if he looks at the different things that would be a candidate in experience, right? So he's got properties or modes, and he's got finite substances, and those are basically mind and bodies. Actually, strictly speaking, of course, at this point in meditation, a body is just an idea. He doesn't know that there are any. And then it seems like there's one sort of thing that is on top of everything else, the infinite substance, right? And his point is he is a finite thing himself, right? He sees his own limitations, right? So he's a finite substance himself. He only has limited abilities. We'll see that he says in Meditation 4 that he has a will that's actually infinite, but as to his being a substance, he's finite, he can't do everything, he's not all-powerful, etc. But he has this amazing idea, right? And there's a causal principle, and that's what you guys are writing about. The cause of an idea must have as much formal reality as the idea contains objective reality. So this is going up in formal reality here. Basically, it's the more real you are, the more formal reality you have, the sort of greater you are. And then ideas, they go off in objective reality, right? Because objective reality is, as it were, the degree of complexity of your ideas, the degree in which your ideas, as it were, get better and better and better, or encompass greater and greater things. And of course, he has also ideas of himself and of bodies if there are any, of finite substances. And he has ideas of properties or modes, thoughts in the case of modes or properties of minds, and colors, shapes, etc. in the case of properties or modes of bodies. But the infinite substance idea is the best idea. It has the most objective reality of all the different ideas. So the claim is, at some crude level, you cannot get something that's this amazing from any source causally except a truly amazing cause. So these are causes and these are effects. Ideas are effects. And in the end, therefore, it's a causal principle argument, right? To get this kind of effect, which is super, super, super powerful, you need this kind of cause, which is the most powerful cause of all. Now, before we subject this to criticism, I just want to make sure that everybody understands the form of the argument. That's the argument put more formally up there, right? Cause and idea must have as much formal reality as the idea contains objective reality. Only a perfect God. I don't use the word perfect God. I just say God, because God for me is the shorthand for a perfect being. So I don't say a perfect being. Only a perfect God. I said this to George, by the way. He still didn't change it in the second edition. But, only a perfect God. He thanks me in the preface, but he didn't make that change. So kind of third edition needs to come out where he makes that change. Only a perfect God has as much formal reality as my idea of God contains objective reality. The cause of my idea of God is a perfect God, therefore a perfect God exists. So it's pretty short as an argument once you get down to it. So, given that, does anybody have any query about the structure of this argument? What?
I just looked to find your name in the press.
Yeah. I mean, there I am, along with a couple of other people. So I am there, right? You validated that empirically. Okay. Because I hadn't come to speak and talk to the students or anything like that. He talked about Berkeley, not Descartes, but he came to speak to the students one year. It was great. Lack of clarity, or is everybody clearly and distinctly perceiving the argument? Okay, good. Of course, you don't clearly and distinctly perceive it as sound. You just clearly and distinctly perceive it right now. Yeah, Hannah.
I'm sorry, could you redefine the difference between formal and objective?
Good. Okay, that's exactly my question. Objective reality probably shouldn't be called reality at all. That's really the shortest thing I can say. Objective reality is something like the degree of complexity of the content of the idea. So if I have an idea of blue, that's a very simple idea. If I have an idea of a blue car, that's a much more complex idea because I've got to have the whole car idea. If I have an idea, well, we have to keep going up and up and up and up. But the next up, if I've already just talked about a complex body, would be the idea of God is even more complex than the idea of a blue car, which is even more complex than the idea of blue. Now, you might think the idea of a blue car is more complex than the idea of a blue box. You might go there as well. You might think the idea of a blue spaceship is more complex than the idea of a blue car. You might think the idea of the universe has more objective reality than the idea of a blue box, because the universe has all that stuff. But those moves between complex and complex and complex and complex ideas within body ideas are still kind of, they're more complexity, but it's really at that point a quantitative difference between them. Whereas the idea of an infinite substance versus a finite substance, no matter how complex your idea of the universe is, it seems the idea of the infinite substance is more complex than the idea of the universe. So if you think that you have such a thing as a really complex idea and a really simple idea, then the really complex idea has more objective reality, and the really simple idea has less objective reality. Now, when you see it that way, you should probably stop thinking of the word reality and just thinking of it as being something like representational content or something like that. It's got more detail to it as an idea. So, if you think of the very basic, the bottom, sort of at the rung here, you've got just a simple idea. And then you think of an idea of a body, and that's got way, way, way more to it. And then you think the idea of an infinite substance. I know how I'm going to do that. It's got like, everything, every kind of which way, all that sort of thing. And that's getting more and more complex as your idea goes up to the idea of infinite substance. Yeah.
But when you're discussing us as finite substances,
yes,
being able to perceive these ideas, would you make the argument that, God is an infinite substance isn't really that complex in the sense that, just like maybe naturally as human beings, we look at everything around us and say, oh, there must be a cause for this. Like, that idea in itself isn't like some huge complex idea, but yeah, if you try to explain the intricacies of a non-deceiving God, I can see how that's a big complex idea for just the simple concept of
okay.
Cause for all this.
I suppose we could distinguish between two different things. One is my thinking there must be a cause. Now, for me, that question, there must be a cause, or that thought, there must be a cause, that isn't yet an idea. Until I think of what is the cause of this thing that I'm thinking is so interesting or amazing, and I posit something as the cause of this. What I posit as the cause, the question then is, how complex is that idea? So you're right, if I ask, the roof is leaking, what caused it? Oh, it must be rain falling on the roof, or somebody spilled a tank. That's not a very, somebody spilling the tank is not a particularly complex, it's complex. But it's not as complex as perhaps, I suppose maybe there are even more complex causes again for why the water comes through, but most of those causes are going to be sort of sufficiently worldly that we don't think of a supernatural cause. But if we think of the entire universe, and we ask, as you do, what caused the universe, at that point, if we posit as a cause of the universe, well, what wouldn't work as a cause of the universe? Let's just put it on you. If I said, here's the cause of the universe, and I turn to something, and what would fail as a cause of the universe if I tried to posit it as something as a cause of the universe? How many different things would fail to cause the universe?
I think a lot of things.
Yeah, a lot of things, right? Imagine that this tin can caused the universe. No. This asteroid caused the universe. No. This planet, no. This other universe caused the universe. Maybe not even that. We needed a cause that's greater than the universe itself. Greater or equal to, but right now it seems that equal to might not even work to cause the universe. So we look for some cause that's more complex. And if we have an idea of that cause, that idea of that cause is where the increased complexity is. Yeah. Oh.
I understand it's a complete complexity, but I don't understand how we couldn't form a God in our head through all the properties and ideas.
Oh, good. Okay, that's exactly the kind of question that we need to have asked. That's the whole point, right? So now I want you to think, he said, not the idea of the universe, because the idea of the universe is actually a limited idea, right? The universe is a pretty big thing, but it's basically just a huge, big body. Because the idea of the physical universe doesn't include technically the souls. It just includes the physical universe, right? So, now the question is, well, wait a second. The claim is not that I have an idea of the physical universe. That's not going to do it. Or even that I have an idea of a soul. That's not going to do it. The idea is I have an idea of God, the infinite substance. And then the point is, well, why couldn't I come up with the idea of infinite substance in some sense myself, or by cobbling together different things? So what's going to be the pushback by Descartes to, I could have come up with the idea of infinite substance kind of by myself? Yeah.
You can only have ideas that come from something else if you can make a meaning of one of those pieces of everything. It's infinite.
Okay, and so why can't I put together some finite things and get an infinite thing?
No matter how many finite things you add up, it's not going to be infinite.
Okay, that's being Cartesian. Yeah, well,
It seemed like he was saying, like, his idea of God was so perfect in his mind, and he was such an imperfect being, that only, like, a perfect infinite substance, like, could cause that idea.
okay,
God
good. Good. You're channeling Descartes. So at the end, what he has is, you're all giving me one. You can't get infinity from what's finite. You can't get the infinite substance from any amount of ideas of finite substance. You can't get more from less. Now, when you literally put it that way, it seems true, right? You can't get more from less. That seems correct. But here's why I want to tell you, if it is correct, it has a ramification for Hope's question. Because Hope's question is like, well, I have this idea of God, but I could have gotten it from these limited sources.
Well,
Yeah.
I get that he's arguing that no, you can't combine properties or finite substances in a way to create an infinite substance, but I just don't necessarily think that that has to be true. Like, I feel like everyone since the beginning of time has had a different idea of God.
Okay. Well,
You know
good.
what I mean?
Right. Okay. So I mean, again, I'm pressurizing this point because in the end, this may be the weakness that upsets the argument. But I want to give the argument its best chance. So the idea is supposed to be this idea of an infinite substance, right? That's how we're going to define God. So it's not that God is supposed to be merely helpful or good. God is supposed to be all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good. Now, that complexity, all-powerful, you have to understand all the different powers that are available to you and say that God has all of them. All-knowing, you have to understand all the different things that can be known and say God knows all of those. And all-good, all the different ways in which one can be good and know that God is all of those ways. Right? That's a complex idea. Some cultures, as Descartes points out, think of a God as being limited, but this idea of God is unlimited. God, on this account, can create an entire universe out of nothing. That's how powerful this being is. So this extremely powerful, well, right now it's an idea, this idea of an extremely powerful being is supposed to be such that there's no possible source from anything we experience. Therefore, the claim is, every culture, whether they realize it or not, has innately the same idea of God as an... Now, here's one point. Descartes does say God has given this idea to all of you. And this is why he calls it the trademark, or the mark of the craftsman, because God has kind of left a thumbprint in every soul that God creates to say, see, I made you. Right? So, there is a sense in which God has ownership of your mind by leaving the fact that an idea of him in your mind, right? Now, we could debate this at greater length, and in some sense, I wish I will debate it in even greater length in some context, but for my purposes today, all I want you to get is there's something correct about the idea that you can't get something better from something worse. There are two ways to go on that idea. One is, since we have this great idea, it had to come from this great cause. The flip side is, since we can't imagine it coming from a great cause, what? Yeah?
No.
Oh, sorry. Since we can't imagine it coming from a great cause, let's say I agree that you can't get better from worse or more from less, right? Let's say I say that that's impossible, right? Right? That's just impossible. Right? Well, it seems that you've got two ways to go. You either say, I have this idea of God that is more than anything else that I could have come up with. Therefore, if there really is a supernatural cause, right? Nothing but God will do, right? Or you go reverse. And the reverse is going to be something like, well, let me hold off on the reverse for a second. I want you to first of all take seriously the idea that the idea is so amazing that it had to have God as its source. So I don't know if this is going to work now, but I did want to, if I can now, play you. But actually I haven't tested the the volume on this, so maybe this is going to work. This is a clip from a movie called K-Pax. Has anybody seen this movie? Okay, not huge numbers, but enough that some know that I didn't just, it's not crazy. I hope the volume is going to play. If it does, great. Okay, it is going to play, yes.
We found your notes quite interesting, Froat, and we'd like to ask you some questions, if that's all right.
This is a guy, a being, who claims to be from another planet. Now, when somebody says, I'm from another planet, your first response is to say, okay, this guy's nuts, right? And they do think he's nuts. But then there was something about something he said about the particular part of the universe that he comes from that they thought, that's kind of curious. Let's check this out.
Be my guest. Good. Then I'll jump right in.
Make sure you can swim.
Yes, well. Let's start with this idea of light travel, shall we? What can you tell us about that?
Absolutely nothing. If I told you, you'd blow yourselves up, or worse, someone else. You'd be surprised how much energy is in a beam of light.
Well then, maybe you could show us how this light travel works.
You mean a demonstration?
That would be fine.
That's a psychiatrist.
Adios, aloha.
When are you gonna...
I'm already back.
See where I come from, Pro? That's called the fastest gun in the West routine.
Well, I don't come from where you come from, Dr. Becker.
Pro, you've indicated in your notes that your planet K-Pax orbits around the twin stars Agape and Satori near the constellation Lyra. Well, frankly, we're a bit mystified as to how you gained knowledge of such a planetary system around these stars.
Professor, where I come from, that's common knowledge.
This was taken from the Hubble. We've computer enhanced it based on Dr. Battel's readings from telescopes in Chile and Hawaii. It's the clearest picture we have of where you come from. What we'd like is if you could diagram on the light pad the orbital pattern that your planet takes through this system.
My pleasure. I think that's right.
Stephen, could you input that?
I'm working on it. What's going on?
I take it my calculations help explain the perturbations you've been seeing in the rotation pattern of your binary star, but have been unable to explain until this moment.
How could you know this? How could you?
Every K-Paxian knows this. Just as every child on Earth knows that your planet revolves around your sun. It's common knowledge, isn't it?
Okay. So the idea here. Sorry, I'm going to mute that. Mute. Oh, I thought that's right. So it's just okay. I'm on the board. The idea here is that it would be too complex an idea for this guy to know that orbital pattern. Because nobody on Earth knows that. And it's just too much for him to have come up with on his own. So if you believed that he didn't read it in some scientific paper, he didn't have access to some crazy astronomer guy who gave it to him, and if you believe that he didn't spend his entire life somewhere, on the basis of even a very limited information we have coming up with this, that's just not something that you can come up with. Yeah.
I was gonna earlier I wanted to go in kind of the same way. What would Descartes say about stuff like creativity? For example, like Joanne K. Rowling imagining the whole world of Harry Potter or Star Wars, or there's like a whole system of complete,
absolutely great.
Stuff.
So here's the argument that he's going to make, and you guys have to realize now that obviously this argument seems pretty good in its pieces, and so where's the problem, as it were? Remember, his assumption is that there are these different levels of existing things, right? So not just that he has different levels of ideas, but he's different levels of existing things. So the claim that he's making, this goes back to even what Will was saying, the claim that he's making is, it's not just that the idea of God is an amazing combination of ideas of other things. So on this account, the world of Harry Potter by J.K. Rowling or the world of Star Wars by George Lucas are actually still combinations in the imagination of Lucas or Rowling of ideas of finite substances with their properties, or, which is I suppose the way to look at the Harry Potter stuff more fondly, as it were, if there's anything in Harry Potter that approximates to an infinite substance idea in Harry Potter, that comes from the source, the one and only source of the idea of infinite substance, which is God. So it's because you know God that you can imagine, I don't know, who's your character out of Harry Potter? I don't know. What's his name? The wizard. What's his name? Dumbledore, right. It's because you know God that you can have an idea of Dumbledore. What is Dumbledore? He's kind of a lesser being than God. But it's the infinite God idea that allows you to know the lesser Dumbledore idea. Or else you have to say Dumbledore is just a recycling of various abilities that you're aware of, as it were, from experience of finite things, finite bodies. So, for example, you might think Superman is a combination of ordinary human strength, ordinary human body ideas, ordinary human sight ideas, ordinary human knowledge ideas, and then you kind of put them together and you get Superman. But it came from elements or materials that are finite. So Descartes' argument is maybe in the end a kind of unfair argument, because what he says is, if it's the case that you think you're getting beyond understanding finite things to understanding infinite something, it's your idea of God that enables you to understand the infinite something. If you're stuck in the level of finite substance ideas, they can never generate the infinite substance idea. If you use anything that gets into infinite substance idea territory, that's because you have the idea of God. And that idea of God allows you to imagine God-like beings in your fantasies. So J.K. Rowling is either just recycling, recombining finite substance ideas and properties, or she's actually using her idea of God and subtracting from that to get the creatures in her novels. So you see, he can't lose, right? It's an unlosable argument that he's making, which is, in fact, Descartes wants to say in the end, the idea of God is your first idea, and everything else is a falling away from that. Yeah, Dan.
Since your existence is based on your belief of God, if you stop believing in God, you stop existing.
Well, existing and believing in existing are totally different things, right? So this book exists, but doesn't believe it exists, right? And maybe some people think if I'm asleep, I'm existing, but I don't believe that I'm existing, right? So existence and believing in existence are totally separate. But I think that since there's no relation between the two except the following: if I believe that I exist, it's true that I exist. That much we can claim. So only the positive in that direction works. If I believe that I exist, I must exist. If I don't believe that I exist, I can still exist. If I exist as a soul, I must be thinking according to Descartes, but bodies can exist and they don't have thoughts. So there's no requirement of a relationship between the fact of existing and the fact of thinking that you exist or believing that you exist. The two can come apart, strictly speaking, because you might say a soul can exist without having thoughts. He doesn't think that, but it's possible. Or a book can exist without having thoughts. What's true is, if I have thoughts, I must exist. It only works in that direction as being a certainty, a proof. But the two are distinct. So it's not that if I ever to think, according to the cogito, maybe I don't exist, that somehow that establishes that I'm not existing. No, I am existing in order to have the thought, maybe I'm not existing. That's why the cogito is supposed to work.
But if you don't believe God exists, then you can't have your first idea.
Here's what he wants to say. You can have the idea, but you can't, well, if you can't believe that God, if you can't know that God exists, you can't establish the truth of your claims. He also wants to say, in a way which I haven't said, is that since the existence of everything depends upon God's existence, he doesn't want to allow for a universe that happened by accident, in which I exist in it. But strictly speaking, I want to say, if you could imagine existing without any idea of God, somehow, because God didn't exist or God didn't give you the idea of God, if you can imagine what it means to live in a world in which there are people or souls existing and bodies existing but no God, a world without anybody having an idea of God, in that world you couldn't imagine or know all the things you know in this world, given that you have that idea of God. And maybe, since obviously you couldn't prove that God exists because you wouldn't have that idea, you wouldn't have the source, because you wouldn't have the effect in you of the idea of God. In that universe where there's no God and there's no idea of God, your ability to imagine things would be incredibly limited, according to Descartes. In fact, I'm not even sure how much of the kinds of higher order mathematics, etc., he thinks you could do in a universe in which there was no idea of God in any of the minds in that universe. It would be a very impoverished ability to think that you would have, according to him. Yeah, I'm not defending that view, but that's what he'll say back to you. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, Paul. Yeah.
If we're talking about this trademark idea
Yeah.
of the market craftsman, that everyone has an idea that God exists.
Yeah.
Why is it that so many different cultures perceive God differently if he all wants them to have?
Good.
If he does exist, why don't we all see him in the same fashion?
Right. Good. Okay. Now this is getting to the idea that is ultimately, I think, the problem for this argument. So he might try to say, look, every culture has the same idea, but some cultures are more advanced in sort of removing the sense experience kind of that clouds judgment. So something like the more scientific and philosophical the culture, the more they arrive at this kind of pure idea of God. The more, and again I'm using kind of what I think Descartes would try to say, the more primitive than thinking about God the culture, because they're more limited by sense experience and don't have science and mathematics, the more the idea of God is unclear to them, and they don't realize the true concept of God, which comes through to your mind when you think about it really, really, really hard. But any member of any culture, anywhere in the world, if they think really hard about God, will arrive at the same idea. But just some of them are basically too embedded in the senses. And they think of gods as being angry. They think of gods as not being able to create the universe, but just being able to affect it a bit. And that's just lack of clarity. So they actually don't have a clear and distinct idea of God because they're subjected to the impressions of the senses too much. That's his claim. That's his claim.
But like it just seems so counterintuitive. Like again, if he's your product, why would he allow?
Right. So again, his claim is not that God literally gave them a bad idea. He gave them the same idea, but they have had these other forces affecting their thinking, which is just too much sensual sense data and not enough metaphysical, mathematical thinking about God. That's how you get to the true idea of God. Just.
But when you use the fact that almost all cultures do have some idea of God as evidence.
Okay, so back at you, as it were. But isn't it true that there's no culture without an idea of God? That would seem to be a crazy thing. A culture without an idea of God, given that they're all made by God, and God puts the mark in every one of them. And so Descartes can say, the evidence from my view is there's no culture without a divine idea. Atheists have an idea of God. So they actually do. I mean, like, if an atheist says God doesn't exist, they must mean by God something. Now, what the atheist doesn't realize is the full idea of God. Because what, according to Descartes, is true about an atheist who fully realizes the God idea, that atheist, if he fully realizes the God idea, must realize that God exists. If he doesn't, he has an imperfect idea, or she has an imperfect idea of God. So atheists are people who have an imperfect idea of God. And theists are those who have, at least on the way towards it, not an actual perfect idea of God. If after you do the meditations, maybe you have a better idea of God, you know there couldn't be an idea of God that wasn't actually correct. But we'll get to the atheist point, because the atheist point would be to deny that the argument works. So, if an atheist says, aha, I have an idea of God, but I know that God doesn't exist, you can say, oh, you have an idea of God. Yeah, where'd you get that from? And if he says, or she says, oh, somebody just made it up. No, impossible that any human being made up the idea of God. So in fact, you've got the atheist, right? Because the atheist admits that there has to be an idea of God for there to be a debate about atheism. Okay, so far we see how if this worked, if you actually had this amazing idea, it seems like you'd need the God cause to create it. But here's the problem. It goes to what people were saying. The objection to Descartes is, we just don't have such an amazing, intricate idea of God. That's the objection. If we did, if you had a perfect understanding of God and how God's powers were combined, how God was able to create the universe, how God is able to allow suffering, how God is able to allow free will, how God is able to make something out of nothing. If you understood all of that, then you would be absolutely convinced that you had to get that idea from God. Because it would be such an amazing idea, right? If you knew all the different, let's say that the subject of religion was just known to you in one flash. Well, that seems miraculous. So the objection is not that the argument has any sort of problem, certainly not problems in terms of validity. The objection is just, I don't have this idea. Not that I have it, but that there's a kind of a normal cause for it. I don't have it in the first place. Yeah.
Would a less than perfect idea of God prove an imperfect God?
No, a less than perfect idea of God would actually establish that the cause of the idea of God was basically a combination of finite substance ideas. So basically, you'd say God is just a slightly exaggerated version of Superman. We know that Superman was created out of the human, or if we accept it, we don't really know how Superman can bend steel. How can that be possible, really? We don't really know how he can fly. Imagine you knew how Superman could fly. I mean, obviously, the gravity is different. That doesn't tell us anything. Come on, I want to know how to fly, right? So if I could know how to fly by just going like that would be a pretty amazing idea. My idea of Superman is like, he can do stuff, but I know how he can do stuff. That's your idea of God. He can do stuff, we don't have a clue how God can do stuff. God can create the universe. We don't know how he can do that. So our idea of God is really just a limited idea. It establishes that the causes are limited causes. Now, it doesn't disprove God's existence. It's not that because we have a limited idea of God that there's no God. That's not fair. It's just there isn't a proof of God if there's a limited idea of God. You can't rely upon the limited idea of God to prove God's existence. Yeah.
So what about Descartes' idea that of like a triangle, someone can have an idea of a triangle
right?
Without having as much knowledge as someone who understands like the specific rules of like geometry.
Okay.
They still understand that a triangle is like 3 sides.
Right. So here's what we're going to say to that. The idea that I can have less than a mathematician's idea of a triangle, or that I can have less than a theologian's idea of God. The claim is not just that, as it were, some people have a really, really, really intricate knowledge of God, and some people have a less intricate knowledge of God, but they both know that they're talking about the same thing in some sense. The point is, even the theologian does not have the necessarily complex idea of God that would make us say the origin of that idea has to be God. Mm-hmm. Theologians are basically like us when we say, how does he travel through time in Back to the Future? Oh, it's the flux capacitor. How does the flux capacitor work? I challenge any of you to explain how the flux capacitor works. If you know, please tell me, and we'll make billions together, right? But you don't know. It's the flux capacitor. That's how it works. We're a bit like that. How does God create the universe? Well, he's just all powerful. We don't know how that gets created because he's all powerful, but it just is. And how does God, regulate all the laws of nature? I mean, he just does, but we don't quite know how that works, right? But theologians are in no better a position.
So, what about like this K-Pax? Like,
well, here's the thing.
Somebody who's not human could have a more intricate idea of God.
Good. So imagine we meet somebody and they explain God completely. Well, prima facie, that's evidence for God, actually. Or how is? Imagine tomorrow you all woke up and you had a perfect understanding of God's goodness, God's power, how God created the universe, how God regulates evil and good. Imagine you understood that perfectly. What would you think happened in the middle of the night? Honestly, what would you think happened? Yeah. You'd actually think that God gave that to you in the middle of the night. So this doesn't rule out that, in other words, every idea of God is kind of a miracle, if it truly is the idea of God that we're talking. And if you had that miracle happen, you would be convinced of God's existence. So I always said that the argument in Meditation 3 is actually an argument from revelation. It's actually a revealing of God. So if you had the revelation, you would believe. Okay? Okay, so the weakness is that you don't actually have the revelation that's needed for the argument. So that's why people don't. So it's not that we have a disproof of God. It's not that we have showing that God doesn't exist. It's that we don't have the more in the first place that needs an explanation that's equally strong. We actually have an idea of God that's pretty limited, pretty murky, pretty indistinct, pretty unclear. Therefore, we don't have what we need for the proof. So if you were to sort of think about this as what would be the problem, it's the premise that you have an idea of God. That's what you dispute. Not that if you had the idea it could only have come from God. That's true, maybe, but that you don't have the idea of God in the first place. However, here's something that's rather interesting and that I champion when I teach this part of the course. Remember I said that there were 2 things to do in Meditation 3 and therefore beyond that in Meditation 4. One is to prove that God exists, and we've seen we haven't quite got a proof of that. The other is to prove that God is not a deceiver. Now here's the argument I want to make. You can prove that God is not a deceiver, even if you can't prove yet that God exists. In other words, the atheist can actually accept a proof that God is not a deceiver, even if the atheist doesn't accept that God exists. So what we want to look at is what's the argument for God not being a deceiver, even if it's separate from proving that God exists. What's the argument that God is not a deceiver? And this argument comes in 2 parts. And the fact that it comes in 2 parts is not always stressed, but you're going to get it from me because I'm particularly interested in the concept of deception. So there are 2 things that we could say about God doesn't deceive. One is deception is intrinsically wrong. Right? Now, what do we know about God? Good. He's good, right? Now, you might want to add another premise, which is something like, therefore God doesn't do what's intrinsically wrong, but I think that's just redundant. We all know what that would mean, right? Deception is intrinsically wrong, or bad if you want. God is good, therefore is not a deceiver. Now that is what I think Descartes believes to be his argument. Yeah?
I think the fact that God is good is our perception that God is good.
Okay, so you might challenge 2 then.
Yeah.
Okay, you might challenge 2. Now interesting, most of his critics didn't challenge 2 because most of them, of course, were of the view that they believed in God and that God was good. But if you challenge 2, one thing that's going to be a problem for you if you're in the middle of the meditations, what's going to be the problem with challenging 2 in the middle of the meditations? Holding claps, because the whole point is that God would never allow you to be deceived by your reasoning going wrong. But if God's evil, then God could indeed allow your deceptions, or allow your clear and perceptions to all be false. So that can't be something that Descartes accepts. So he's going to challenge you. But he does have an argument. Now, I'm not going to be able to defend it beyond doubt, but here's his argument. He wants to say God is good because actually he thinks that goodness, being good, is a perfection. And God, the meaning of God is being with all perfections. So he thinks that goodness is a perfection and evil or badness is an imperfection. Therefore, he thinks it's not a matter of decision or judgment or interpretation. We just know that the meaning of God is the meaning of being with all perfections. Evil is an imperfection, so you couldn't have a being that has all perfections has an imperfection. That just can't be possible. So he's going to say the meaning of God is good. Goodness is contained in the end, meaning of God. Therefore, it's just a false possibility to say that there could be a God who is evil. It wouldn't be God if it was evil. That's his objection. Yeah,
but if God's all powerful, wouldn't he have the power to do both good and evil?
yes, but the power to do evil is not the same as to be evil. Yeah, well, chooses, again, some people are going to say literally chooses, and others are going to say, well, as it were, God isn't whimsical in saying, I won't be evil today. I could, but God is of the view that, as it were, this is the question is, could God be evil really? Would that not be, as it were, against God's nature to be acting evilly? Because evil is an imperfection. It's like, could God act imperfectly? Well, maybe in some sense, it's a logical possibility that God could just murder somebody. But on this account, for God to be doing that would be for God to be, as it were, going against God's own nature. And that's not something that God would do. But at least the following is true. If God has the power to do evil, he never does evil, or she never does evil, or it never does evil. God only does good. Yeah, Henry.
Could you make the argument that, so I guess we've acknowledged that, the idea of God is a very complex idea.
Right.
And I feel like good and bad, you can make the argument that those are kind of things that we have derived from our senses, like deception is bad, so...
Actually, why do you think you've derived from your senses that deception is bad? Let me put that up to a test.
It's like, if you deceive me, then, like, I don't know, it gives me a bad feeling or a bad sense.
So, because I think that you're going to suffer in some way that's, you just want to say, kind of experiential, that's why I think I shouldn't deceive you.
I don't know.
Okay, so you might think my reasoning about this, for one, is an empirical kind of reasoning, experiential reasoning. And then you're worried about the truth of one.
Well, I mean, I guess deception is making someone, could you say deception is like making someone think one thing is true whenever in reality something else is true?
Well, it's certainly the opposite of what's true. In other words, it's to get them to think of falsehood. That's what deception is. Yes. Now, here's the thing. You might think every time a person believes a falsehood, that's going to result in a bad experience for them. But actually, that's not true, right? Sometimes believing a falsehood can result in a good experience for people because
it's not always bad.
Okay. Now, that would be to challenge one. So my point to you is this. Some people might challenge two, right, but actually, that is almost a definitional matter of God for Descartes. Therefore, that's not going to work. And he can't work according to his own construction of the meditations, because that would undermine. And you might say, well, so much the worse for his construction of the meditations, but that God could be bad is much more controversial than what Andrew is suggesting. What Andrew is suggesting is that deception could be good. Yeah.
What about, like, if Descartes said God is being with all perfection, and what about someone saying that deception is one of the abilities of, like, one of perfection? Like, ability to deceive is one of perfection, so God.
Wait, are you saying, I want to just say, so if I say, deception is an imperfection, or a being that engages in deception is an imperfect being.
Okay, but like, someone could think that the ability to deceive someone.
Right. So, imagine somebody says the following. There are times when deception is right and good, that I must deceive in order to do something in the world that's good. In that situation, you might think, that claim is really the claim that deception is not an imperfection, that sometimes deception is a perfection, or at least sometimes deception is good. So at the very least, we can't say deception is always wrong or always bad. We have to say it's normally or usually bad or wrong, but there are some times when it's actually good. Now, does everybody see the force of that objection? Sometimes deception is actually a good thing. Sometimes it can be for a good end, and that therefore it will be right for a person to deceive. Anybody who read Republic, Book 1, will remember there's an argument there that says, if you borrow a weapon from your friend and your friend goes mad, and your friend then comes back and asks you for the weapon, you should lie that you don't have it on you. Right? Yeah.
But I think it still wouldn't invalidate the argument that God is not a deceiver.
Okay. I was hoping somebody might say that, yeah? Right, yeah.
It's, in that way, wouldn't God know? It wouldn't be the deception that he means, in the sense that we're deceived into believing we don't, like, we exist when we really don't. Like, it doesn't relate to God's power or intention. It's just like some instance, in like some practical instance, that
Okay.
kind of doesn't really relate to.
Well, I think
I
it's
can't explain, but
yeah.
I feel like God could, like, the idea of God as like the supreme being,
Yeah.
is not harmed by the fact that sometimes, in some instances, some way of deception might be favorable.
Okay, so I want to agree with what you just said, but I want to unpack it a bit. So let's make the first argument as follows. You could say he's wrong to insist that deception is always bad or wrong. You could say Descartes just got that wrong. Descartes thinks, no, deception is always bad. So even in the case of the person who's borrowed the spear, you shouldn't lie to him. So that's what Descartes' position is, I think, in the end. I mean, I'm writing a paper on this. I think Descartes' position in the end is you should never lie to a Nazi. Ever, 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 ever. Now, most people just think, no, you can lie to Nazis to save people. Of course you can. And Kant argued that you couldn't, but he was crazy. Descartes. And there was Hobbes and some others said to him, look, doctors lie to patients, so that the patients won't get the bad news and sort of die of a heart attack as soon as they get the bad news that their kid has been killed in the accident or that they're going to die in 5 weeks. No, you're going to live for ages. Or parents lie to kids, whether it's Santa Claus. Hey, surely there are some lies that are okay. And he's just wrong. He's going to say, no, they're all wrong. But here's the argument that I have made. Okay, imagine that you're at the door, the Nazi is there, the Nazi says, okay, where are your Jewish children? And you say, I don't have any. You got the wrong address, right? Why am I saying to them, I don't have any, you got the wrong address? What am I trying to do? Save the children. The children. I mean, I'm actually assuming that there are children of others whom you've sort of taken in and hidden because you're okay by the Nazi authorities, but the children are not. You're trying to protect the children. Okay, imagine you're God and the Nazis knock on your door. What do you do? Just, whoom, Nazis up in the middle of the air, right? Oh! Or the Nazis, I'm going to send you back to the time of the dinosaurs. See how you feel there. Bang. You're all powerful, right? You can do absolutely anything you want. You can change time. You can have Nazis never exist. You can convert the Nazis to loving everybody right there on your doorstep, right? Right? You can do anything, right? You're all powerful. Why would you lie? Isn't that the most kind of powerless thing to do to the Nazis, is to lie to them?
Because you can.
Well, but that can't be enough for reason. Okay, sorry. Actually, imagine the sort of person who can do all those things to Nazis, but you know what you choose to do to Nazis? You choose to give them false beliefs. Now, here's the argument. Now, you may say, well, they're evil. So, well, but even, here's I think, the point that Descartes was saying. If you're God, and you're all powerful, and you're all good, then you wouldn't deceive the Nazis. You would do something to the Nazis. I mean, you might convert them to the truth of loving everybody, but that's not deception. That's conversion. And that's still okay, I suppose, unless you think that you should give them reasons to believe that you shouldn't harm people. But the point is, I take it that the difference between us and God is that we're limited. God is not. So we sometimes have to lie to protect people and to do good. God never has to lie. So what would be the only reason for God ever deceiving you? Because it's fun. And that's something God would never do. Would never deceive you just for kicks. Right? That would actually be kind of evil. Yeah?
What about like deception, like in terms of like tests? Like I'm thinking about like the Christian Bible story.
Okay.
Where it's like Abraham and his son
Isaac.
has to go
Right.
sacrifice Isaac, and then the last second goes, oh, never mind.
Good.
Sacrifice the animal over there.
Good.
Isn't that like in a sense deception?
So some people, good.
Abraham of what his intentions.
Right. So here's what I take to be an argument here, although this is beyond what Descartes ever says. You might think, look, first of all, this is an argument for why we should go back to the original claim. What I just said is, there's certain context which is okay, but you might still think we should stick to God. Deception is always wrong. And therefore we have to reject the Bible story. It's actually inconsistent with God. But imagine you say, look, the Bible story is a test. It's kind of a limited deception, or it's got a built-in, point at which God reveals, no. So it wouldn't be outright deception. It would be, as it were, temporary deception or limited deception. And that would be the only way to defend such cases. In other words, God didn't actually command Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. He just tested Abraham to see would he do it, and would never have allowed Abraham to do it. That's the kind of idea. Now, I think this is beyond anything that we've got in the philosophers, but I think Descartes would really have to say every single example of so-called deception or God sort of making you do evil in the Bible has to be reread so that he never actually intended that you do that in some sense. You have to reread the Bible stories. Now, you might think, no, the Bible stories give you an angry, jealous, testing God. But here's one thing you could think. You could think God is testing you by having you be deceived in some situation. The trouble is, in the case of the deception that he's ultimately worried about in Meditation 3 and 4, which is that you could be wrong about your clear and distinct perceptions, there's no, as it were, way in which God could be fooling you about those and it'd be a test, or that God is fooling you about those and sort of eventually God says, like when you go to heaven, all the mathematics was all false. No, that would actually have been God deceiving you. That wouldn't be like a temporary thing. That's, I suppose, the argument. He doesn't say that, but that would be the argument that, actually, if your clear and distinct perceptions can be wrong, that's not a joke, that's not a test, that's deception by God. So even if there was such a thing as testing you, that would fail to be tested. Okay, now I could say more, but I want you to see, even if you just believe what I said, even if you believe that God doesn't actually deceive you, there's still a problem. Because, as I pointed out at the beginning, the idea that God is not a deceiver has actually got two elements to it. Or I hope I said this, maybe I didn't, but if I didn't. One is that God himself doesn't deceive you. But of course, even if God himself didn't deceive you, you can still say, why am I ever deceived? Isn't it the case that God allows me to be deceived? So, how about this? Imagine that somebody says, look, I am sometimes mistaken, right? I'll say mistaken because the word deceive sometimes implies a deceiver, and we don't want to prejudge that, right? I am sometimes mistaken. God allows me to be, or mistaken, deceived. Maybe I'll put it that way. Okay. To be mistaken or deceived. Therefore, God is a deceiver. Somebody could make that argument. In fact, Descartes worries in Meditation 4 that is indeed the problem. If you allow somebody to be deceived, then you are a deceiver. Now, independently of the argument in Descartes, I have argued elsewhere that that's false, because the fact that I allow somebody to be deceived doesn't make me a deceiver. However, people might disagree with me. They might say, no, if I don't stop a person who has a false belief, if I don't correct their false belief, I am culpable. I'm actually participating in the deception of that person. So let's say somebody's walking around and they believe that, there's no class tomorrow, and there is a class, and you don't tell them. Are you a deceiver? Well, people think, that seems pretty deceptive. So maybe this is an argument that's valid. That if I believe one, I believe two, I have to believe the conclusion. Maybe. So the question is, if this is a valid argument, sometimes, and if Descartes won't accept this conclusion, what should we deny? Remember, if I believe one, if I believe two, and if I must believe the conclusion, it's a valid argument, right? But Descartes can't have it be a sound argument, because that means that the conclusion is true, and that's what's going to destroy his theory, yeah?
Rather than God allowing me to be mistaken, I think Descartes' move is to say that our own imperfection is what allows us to be mistaken or deceived, and so it's not really God actively deceiving us, so he can't be labeled as a deceiver.
Okay, well, I agree. We have to attack two, and the question is, how is it the case that God is somehow not responsible for the fact of one? So Descartes accepts two and accepts one and denies two. So how does he deny two? How does he show that deception is not really by God? Well, here is the argument that he makes, which I'll give as quickly as I can, but it's embedded in a much more detailed argument that Descartes gives about the problem of evil. Here's the thing. God, as it were, gives you the power to never, ever, ever be mistaken. God gives you the power to only have true beliefs. You have that ability, and God gave it to you. So if you ever have a false belief, it's your problem, your mistake, not God's. Imagine all my students could blame me for doing badly on their exams. That would be pretty terrible, right? I can't be blamed, right? If I give you correct, if I give you truth, and you give me back falsehood, right? I can't be blamed. Only you can be blamed if that happens. It's like, oh, Professor Mann deceived me. I wrote an incorrect answer in his exam. No. You didn't give the answer which I gave in class. Your problem, not mine, right? So this is what Descartes argues. God actually gives you the ability for one to never, ever, ever happen. And if it happens, that's on you. Now, where have we seen that argument before? Well, basically, it's often called the free will defense, right? But it's the free will defense normally of doing, not being mistaken, but being evil, right? So let's say I am sometimes evil. I sometimes hit people, steal, lie. God allows me to steal or lie. Therefore, God is a liar or a bad God anyways, right? That seems like a bad argument, right? But you can see how people might think the fact that some people do evil is, as it were, either proof that there's no God or that God is a bad God. So here's Descartes' argument. No, this is, when are you mistaken ever in Descartes' thinking. When is it the case that you ever have a false belief? Yeah?
The devil will want you to.
Oh, well, we have imagined, of course, now, we have to imagine the world in which Descartes has established that God exists and there's no devil. So imagine the good version. You're right that right now you still have to prove that in some sense because we disproved the... But imagine you've proven that God exists and even that God is good. When is it that you would make a mistake when God exists and is good? Yeah, Esther?
Did he say that it was a combination of intellect and will?
Okay, that's correct. That allows for this. So what is the situation in which you would ever have a false belief? What was it that you did?
Because your will exceeds the understanding, the true understanding that you actually have.
Okay, so what was it that your will, as it were, went for, that your intellect gave it? What did your intellect have that your will sort of went for? Assume. When do you ever assume something to be true?
You don't know it is true.
We don't know, sir. When do you not know that something is true? When it's not clear and distinct. So here's the rule. Clear and distinct, right? True. And you're never going to go wrong there. Unless God is a deceiver and we're basically in the process of eliminating that one. So, what about if it's not clear and distinct? What should you do when you have an idea that's not clear and distinct?
You shouldn't make any decisions about it.
None. Think of those quiz shows, right? You've got like 4 answers. You get it down to 2 answers. You know, the capital of some country or whatever is this city or that city. And what should you do when you don't know which of the 2 answers it is?
Wikipedia.
Well, you can't do Wikipedia. What should you do? Stop.
Yes.
No! That's what Descartes says you should never do. Now, of course,
If you're on a game show, it's kind of different.
yeah. But how about if you lose all your money if you get the wrong answer? Because I should risk it. According to Descartes, it's wrong even to risk. You should, at that point, say, I don't know. I'm going home with my money. Now, you have the ability, according to Descartes, to never make a single mistake in your life. Ever. To have no false beliefs whatsoever. If only you abide by this. If only you abide by that. God has given you the ability to suspend judgment on things that are not clear and distinct. If you go through your life suspending judgment when they're not clear and distinct, you will never be in situation 1. God gave you the power to never do anything mistaken. Ever. Yeah.
Don't you have to first, sort of, believe something false or make a mistake to understand the idea of falsely believing?
Okay, that's a good question. So, would it be the case that you have to, as it were, start anew at some point in your adulthood? Let's say you start anew in your adulthood like Descartes did. Well, at least God has given you the ability to start anew and have no false beliefs. So maybe you have to go through childhood and puberty and teenagehood, and then eventually get to the point where you say, okay, let's scrap them all and see which ones are clear and distinct. But He's given you that ability. God has given you the ability to never do wrong. And that's like the free will defense. God has given you the ability, you all have the ability to never sin. If you ever sin, it wasn't because you were unable to sin, it was because you chose to sin. So if ever you come to a false belief, it's because you chose to leap ahead when you should have suspended judgment because it was unclear. Now this means that he has a distinction between, on the one hand, the intellect, which gives us the ideas, and they'll be in propositional form, right? The intellect, right, gives you the ideas, but I suppose I should say affirm is really what I have in mind here. The affirm or suspend judgment, that's the will. So the intellect gives you the sort of things about which you make judgments of the will. So you have 2 faculties. If you use those 2 faculties properly, is it clear and distinct? No, suspend judgment. Is it clear and distinct? Yes, affirm. If you just went through life living that way. Now, remember, suspend judgment doesn't mean do nothing. in the case of the quiz show, I did something. I stopped. I went home with the money. And imagine it's like when you can't, as it were, you come, you know that famous Yogi Berra? I much later in life, I discovered that the cartoon character Yogi Berra was based on this baseball player called Yogi Berra. I didn't know Yogi Berra at all. But anyways, Yogi Berra, much quotable. There was this famous saying of Yogi Berra: when you come to a fork in the road, take it. Okay? So, why do we say, well, I don't know which way is going to get me to wherever I'm going? You can say, you know what? I'm not saying this is the right road. Is everybody? I'm not saying it's the right road, but I'll try it. But I'm not saying it's the right road. Don't say if I go and I end up in the wrong place that somehow, no, this might not be it. 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 Oh, and it doesn't matter what I get, because I said this might not be it. This might not be it. So I was never wrong. So it's not that you can't act, but you should never affirm. You should keep it suspended. Even if you're right, you should say, I didn't affirm, I kept it suspended. And that will never be mistaken. Yeah?
What about if you're like in a dream and it's like a really clear dream and you're like, for that moment, I guess you affirm that what you're receiving is accurate?
Except that, it's tricky. According to Descartes, you actually shouldn't be affirming the existence of the things that are in experience, because about that you actually don't have clear and distinct perceptions. If you have mathematical thoughts, and if those are truly clear and distinct, you can affirm those. Or maybe you could affirm in a dream that you exist, or you can affirm in a dream that God exists. So there are the clear and distinct ones you can still affirm in a dream. The stuff that he actually might say, right now, my confidence that I'm actually in a room in Washington and Lee might be so low that I shouldn't affirm that. I should suspend judgment on whether I'm still going to teach you guys, but I should suspend judgment whether I'm actually in a room in WNL. But I might still be able to affirm that I exist, that God exists, and that 2 plus 3 equals 5, or whatever it is. So you can have a life in which you affirmed much less than you do. But the point is, you can have a life in which you never go wrong if you use the tools that God gave you. If your car overheats because you accelerate while, pushing down your emergency brake, don't blame the car manufacturer. That's you. You didn't use it properly. So if you have false beliefs ever, you did not use your intellect and your will properly. Yeah.
Just to clarify, intellect allows you to know something's clear
and distinct.
And will is affirming
or denying. Yeah, so I put in, because basically the thought that is clear and distinct for Descartes, the thing about it is he thinks that you automatically move to affirmation at that point. So it is the will that affirms, but strictly speaking, he thinks when that happens, you actually can't but affirm. It is instantaneous, but it's still supposed to be an act of freedom. And let me just make one point, because I won't be able to go back to this Cartesian circle. I imagined I wouldn't be able to go back to the Cartesian circle, probably. I have given you a defense of his argument that says, if ever you are making a mistake or you are deceived, it's you doing what's wrong and not God. But you might say, why didn't God just make us such that, couple things. First of all, one, why didn't he make us just be unable to affirm unclear and indistinct ideas? Yeah? Just be unable to do it, even if we wanted to do it.
Maybe because the ability to choose is good.
Well, here's what he does say. He says that you have more will than you had to have is kind of a gift.
Is that because it's based on the fact that God has that ability also?
Well, he does. Yeah. He does say this. He says the fact that you have a will, he actually thinks your will is infinite. So it is actually the one piece of you that is, your intellect is finite because you don't know everything. But your will is infinite in the sense that it can affirm anything. It can affirm, strictly speaking, it can affirm things that aren't true, right? So your will can range over way more than what your meager, somebody else's intellect could provide you with stuff and you could affirm that, right? So the point he wants to make is, your will is this amazing ability that you have. It's so amazing that it can get you into trouble. But it's kind of like I gave you a computer and I say, I'm going to give you a computer with like a million, Here's the memory. It's like 1 million. And you're going to say, why didn't you give me more limited? Like, why can't it be that I only affirm the clear and distinct stuff? I want a more limited will, and you've given me a much bigger will than I asked for. Well, you can hardly blame God for that. Unless you think God has given you the power to make mistakes, and he shouldn't have given you that power. But here's what Descartes, I think, wants to say. Actually, if you use your power correctly, you've got everything you need, but this limitation is the really curious one. Because couldn't God have given you an intellect in which you know everything? Why couldn't God have done that? Wouldn't that solve everything, right? I would both never make mistakes and I'd know everything. Isn't that the best deal of all? Why didn't God give me that deal? Now, what's the quick answer to why God didn't give me that deal? Anybody suggest what is the quick answer? Also a quick answer?
Because you just be God.
You'd be God at that point? One answer is you would be God. Now, I don't know if that's fair, but it's close to being God would make you kind of an all-knowing angel. Why couldn't God do that? And this is the point at which Descartes does say something like, actually, we don't know why God didn't give us the big intellect that he could have given us, like the big will. We have to believe that he's good, therefore he has a reason, and the reason is we somehow form part of a bigger picture that's all good. But here's one answer very quickly. I won't be able to develop it, but I will give. There is one possible explanation, which goes back to a little bit what Paul said about tests. It may be that God doesn't care about what you know. What God cares about is this. Did you use it properly? So on the day of judgment, God's going to say, okay, how many mistakes did you make given that I gave you the power to never make mistakes? And if you say, none, God's going to say, yay, well done, great, next. Oh, no, I made a bunch of mistakes. You're bad. I gave you the power to never make mistakes. Okay, you go to the other place, right? It may be that God is testing in a sense. So that might be one way to try to explain why God would give us less than a perfect intellect. Less than a perfect will. That this is in some sense, God's interested in seeing how you do. Okay, I'll stop there. Now, here's the thing about papers. I'm going to be sending them back electronically today, so you will get them today. I hope before lunchtime, but definitely today. And I will send out a question for Thursday. Again, I have to sit in on class, but again, I'll send it out today. The question for Thursday will be about meditation 4 and something maybe to do with the Cartesian circle. I'm still deciding on that, but we may get to, we are going to get to the Cartesian circle at the beginning of the class Thursday, and then the rest of meditation 5 on Thursday. Now, come this weekend, I think I have to start organizing your paper topics. So I might end up sending those to you as early as Thursday, so that you have the next 2 weeks to work on them. But they are coming. Anyway, I will return things today, and there'll be a short question for Thursday, and that'll be the last short question before your paper. Okay, see you then.